Okay,
All
so
right.
let's begin now. Welcome to On the Half, where we hold a discussion with playwrights, filmmakers, and artists whose work we will be featuring in this year's Hamilton Arts Festival, which will be from June 15th to June 24th. My name is Ebony Kane, and I'm the social media coordinator here at PPADC, and I will be moderating these talks. And today we will be featuring Monica Prince, who teaches activist and performance writing at Susquehanna University, and her amazing choreopoem poem Roadmap, which is our center stage featured event for PPADC's Hamilton Arts Fest this year. And we are beyond excited because we have a long lasting relationship with Monica. She's assisted us in a previous project. So before we get started, Monica, would you like to further talk about your experience and your journey of becoming a writer and what led you to write Roadmap?
Absolutely. So I've been writing my whole life. But I actually started writing choreo poems when I was in college after I read Entasaki Shange's For Color Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow's Enough, which is considered the first choreo poem, like officially, because she created this genre. And I started writing them in kind of a response to the fact that you could combine performance poetry with dance and music and art. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. I love that. I want to do that. So I started writing them in college, and this how I started writing Roadmap was it started as a bet I had with my ex-boyfriend, is that he wanted his story to be told, right? Like his life story. And so I interviewed him several times, and we talked about his life, and I wrote this choreo poem in response to it. But then there was like there was something strange about his story because there was a lot of things I couldn't corroborate. And I remember thinking, like, I can't present a story that I can't corroborate, basically. Like, I need to make sure that this is all factual. So I left the project alone for a while, and we stopped talking as we were wont to do. And when I was hired at Susquehanna, I staged my other choreo poem, How to Exterminate the Black Woman. And I staged that with students on campus, and it's all about women and Black women. And after the show, it was like a huge success. But after the show, a lot of the Black men on campus came up to me and said, "This is really great. Like, but what about us?" And I was like, what about y'all? Like, what do you mean? And they're like, I think it would be really interesting for there to be some show like this that was focused on Black men. And I was thinking about it. I was like, that's a really good point. I'm not sure if I'm the person who should write this show. And I said, no, we think you should. And so I picked Roadmap back up, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, there's something about this show that I think could be, there's parts of it that I want to salvage, right? Because I don't really care about, this ex-boyfriend's life anymore. And I would rather focus on the issues that I really care about, which are like the Black experience um and just like what it means to survive in America as a Black person. And so I looked at Roadmap again, and there are parts that I really loved, like the fact that there was a social worker, a doctor, and a therapist who would come on stage and like state facts based on what you had seen. And I really like that element of it because I did a lot of research for it. And so I was like, what if we still did something like that, but I did it the with the concept, like focusing on a Black man. And so I started doing more research on Black men in general, and I found this horrific statistic from the CDC that stated that Black men ages 15 to 34, their most likely cause of death is homicide. And that was like really upsetting. And I was like, I can't even believe that. Like, that's a real statistic. And so I dove deeper into that statistic, and I started writing poems like around that concept of like, what does it mean for Black men to live in a world where they basically know they're going to be killed? And so I created the character of Dorian, and I just kind of wanted to see what it means for a Black man to investigate that sort of assumption that living in the world makes them a target, that choosing to be alive is a resistance strategy. And so I wrote the show basically based around that statistic. And I kept in some of the original research I did, but then I did more research about Black women and fertility, Black households, marriage when it comes to Black men and Black women, doing a lot of research into how children in abusive homes are raised, how children of sex workers are handled, and so on and so forth. So like just all this research that went into the show to really think about how to present this perspective of a Black man. But ultimately, what I was thinking about when I was finishing the show was thinking about my little brother because he's a Black man, and thinking about my father and my uncles and my cousins and all the Black male students that I've taught like over the years. And ultimately, when I finally finished the show for the first time, when it was staged at Susquehanna in 2019, one question that came out of the audience from then my he wasn't yet, but my future husband, was he was like, I really love that there's this focus on Black love in the show itself, how the show is ultimately about Black love. And I remember thinking like, yeah, actually that's what the show really is about. It's about Black men, but it's mostly about how we love them and how we can love them better. And so I so that yeah, that answers the question. That's the question, right?
Yes,
That's
it does. It's perfect. It answers the question. Thank you so much. And it was really powerful what you said about how you began writing Roadmap with the statistic in your mind surrounding Black men and homicide, because having read it, that is like the through line in the
Mhm.
piece. And my personal favorite character, the novelist, really does an amazing job of exploring that. Can you go a little bit more into detail about like Dorian? And he is a young Black man, as you said, he's centered, and he is essentially on this quest to thwart his inevitable murder, and the novelist is a guide for him. Can you like go into detail a little bit more about how that came to be, and also how and why you chose the choreo poem specifically as your mode of storytelling? And exactly what is a choreo poem too? Because I feel like some
Oh
people
yeah.
might be wondering that.
Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. We'll start with what a choreo poem is. That's a good question. What is a choreo poem? So a choreo poem is a choreographed series of poems that involve performance poetry, dance, music, art, other forms of performance media. So there could be yoga in it. Um, there could be parkour, memes, videos, like sound bites, all kinds of stuff. So anything that we engage in a performance lens can be in a choreo poem. And so the reason I choose choreo poems as my storytelling mode is because A, I'm a poet and like, I'm a poet, but also B, like I think poetry has I think it's the easiest form of accessing art because the choreo poem itself is, something that happens on a stage. It's presented like a play. But because it's so collaborative and because it requires a lot of investment with the audience, it brings the audience into the story, right? So it's not just you're sitting, politely in the audience being quiet. Like the actors are with you in the audience, they are engaging with you, they're talking to you, they're asking you questions. And I think that changes the way that we operate as audience members because it changes our perspective of what it means to engage with our media. And so as someone who like, I talk at movies, like I don't go to movie theaters anymore because like nobody wants to like I talk to the screen. I have feelings, right?
Mhm.
And so which is why I watch movies alone in my house because nobody wants to watch movies with me. And what I like about the choreo poem is like you can do that. You can talk back to the actors, you can talk back to what's happening on stage. And so by utilizing that particular format, it kind of blends what I really love about poetry and what I really love about in media in general is that you can engage with it. So with Dorian, I chose Dorian because he actually appears in How to Exterminate the Black Woman, but not really. He is the miscarried son of the main character in How to Exterminate the Black Woman. She performs this poem. One of the characters, Loss, performs this poem called Lost as a Canyon, and it's about her miscarrying and how she didn't even know her body could do that, right? And the child that she names who she miscarried is Dorian. And so I remember taking Dorian from How to Exterminate the Black Woman and putting him as a center part of Roadmap because I wanted to explore a version of Dorian if he had survived, right? Like if he had lived, if he, didn't, if he wasn't lost. And so with the way that Dorian interacts with the novelist, who's his like omniscient muse guide person, right? Is that the novelist is this ageless sort of ancestor who can see every possible future and who knows how Dorian's life is going to end. But she also knows that he can make choices that can change the way that his life ends. And so, what I really love about their relationship is nobody can see the novelist except for Dorian. And the only other person who can see the novelist near the end of the show is Aisha, who's his beloved. And the only time she's able to see him is when she becomes pregnant with his child. And so there's this emphasis that it's Dorian's bloodline that has to be maintained in order for the novelist to like keep his story going. And so the, I lost the question. Hold on. Question was about Dorian. I lost the question. Can you repeat the question?
No, no problem. So it was about why you chose the query poem, which you hit on, and also the novelist and Dorian's relationship, which is what you were explaining as kind
Okay.
of the omniscient character throughout.
Yes. So the novelist is showing Dorian a bunch of different versions of himself, essentially. And so she shows him, and she also is the person to kind of emphasize when he's committing, like when he's doing the wrong thing. So there's a moment where he is not fighting with her, but he's like having an argument with Aisha and they're talking about their relationship. And he emphasizes, like, I don't want to be monogamous. And she says, great, that's awesome, because I don't want to do that either. And he's like, but I don't want you to be with anybody else. And she's like, that's a double standard. And the novelist makes this whole point about like you need to be good, like be good in this moment, like do the right thing. And she keeps like pushing him to make the right choice because she wants him to live, like she wants him to survive. And so their relationship is really interesting because he takes her advice in the moment, and even when he makes a mistake, she she kind of tries to course correct him. So there's another scene earlier in the show where he's talking about his parents' relationship and he's making this whole point about like how like he has a phrase that says abuse is love, we all learned. And it's the kind of way that we how we train little kids to, if you like her, then hit her. Right. And then we tell the little girls, like, yeah, well, if he hits you, it's because he likes you, kind of thing. And we teach this lesson over and over again. And then we kind of like it becomes ingrained in our personalities as we get older. So when Dorian sees his parents like fighting, but then they end up kissing and making up, like he doesn't see it as a problem. And so there's just kind of this moment where the dancers and the novelists are emphasizing, like, here's what this sounds like and here's what it actually is. And he realizes, he's like they're not going to kill each other, it's just how they love. And it's this thing that we've embedded in our culture as Black people, that there are certain types of behaviors that we engage in that are meant to be acts of love, like spanking, or actually mostly spanking, which is like viewed as this kind of act of love, right? And because it's the idea of like, I'm going to punish you, and this little bit of harm is going to change the way you act. But I'm doing this because I love you. And we internalize that. So we're actually not surprised, but we don't realize that we repeat these types of behaviors, not in terms of spanking, but in terms of like like hitting someone playfully when we think they're like funny, but also it's like whatever they're saying is problematic, or threatening violence in our speech, knowing we're not actually going to do the thing. And what the novelist does essentially with Dorian is she tries to emphasize to him, like, just because this is how it's always been doesn't mean this is how it always has to be. And that is something that Dorian tries to internalize throughout the rest of the show, is recognizing where he's perpetuating harm when he doesn't have to do that. And so the what I really love about their relationship is that he listens to her, because one of my favorite moments in the show is where he proposes to Aisha And Aisha says yes. And the novelist says something like, you know, don't let this woman die for you the way that every Black woman has before, which was also the reason that I wrote this show, is that there's this emphasis of Black women where we have always been responsible for making sure Black men stay alive. And that shows up in the civil rights movement, that shows up in the Harlem Renaissance, it showed up with um it shows up more importantly in slavery, right? The ways that Black women would literally have themselves killed to save Black men. Like Harriet Tubman went back to go get her husband and he said no. Like she went to go get him. And it's like this, and he threatened to turn her in. And instead of, and it's this whole problem, right? How historically Black women have done the work to save and keep alive Black men. And there are moments in which they do not pay us back by harming us, by leaving us, by not loving us. And what I really wanted to drive home in Roadmap with Dorian was to demonstrate, look at this Black love, but look at the way that the woman he has chosen refuses to die for him. Like she will support him and she'll take care of him, but she refuses to die for him. And it's important that that comes across in the show, because there is this constant sacrifice that Black women are expected to do for to keep Black men alive. And I want that emphasis to be put throughout the show, that Dorian is the main character, but he's the main character because of all these women who have managed to keep him alive, which is why we focus on the grandmother and his mother, and less so his father and the unnamed grandfather. Like there's a focus on how these women have kept him alive.
Yes, thank you so much. I definitely see that, and I appreciated that a lot about Roadmap. And it also has to do, I think you hit on it a little bit, with more so like the generational trauma within the lineage of the Black experience in America, and how that relates to the Black man and the Black woman's role within all of that, and uplifting, as you're saying, Black men in a society where everything is against Black people, specifically Black men. And what I also appreciated about Roadmap, which is what I want to get into a little bit, is your decision to include like hashtags surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement. And at times it feels like, you're hinting on the politicalness of the Black body, although Black people don't want to necessarily be politicized. We're just existing, but how that plays a role into being a Black person in America, specifically a Black man, where violence is constantly being perpetuated against you, as well as instances for Black women too. Um, so could you just like talk a little bit about your intention and choice in including that within Roadmap alongside Dorian and his story?
Oh yeah. Something I learned while writing, I wrote a play a couple years ago on suffrage in the United States, and it was about how all it was like about a lot of the like untold and forgotten stories of women of color associated with the suffrage movement. And something I learned, or a quote that I pulled from it, was from, oh, I'm gonna say her name wrong. Patsy. Ooh, yep, I'm gonna say her name wrong. But one of the first Asian American women in Congress, she made a point about talking about. Nope, it wasn't her. It was the first mayor of Puerto Rico, governor of Puerto Rico. Something. Anyway, not important. Point is, the political is personal, because when your body is politicized, everything you do now becomes political. And so when we're talking about Black people and Black bodies, and because Black bodies are constantly being legislated or harmed in the name of justice, we have to recognize that we don't have a choice but to engage in politics because our bodies are being politicized. And so I think a lot about how in Roadmap, we start off with Dorian being shot, right? Like we see Dorian get shot, and he becomes a stand-in for every like young unarmed child who gets shot in the streets. And the emphasis around that is like that always becomes a political issue. It's not just about the fact that an unarmed child has been killed, it's also about, okay, well, who killed them? Was it a cop or was it a regular person? Okay, if it was a cop, then we need to talk about the rights of people when they're interacting with law enforcement. And then that becomes a conversation about abolishing the police. Do we need the police? So on and so forth. If it's not a cop, in the case of like Trayvon Martin, then who is this person? Why do they have a gun? And now it becomes a conversation about gun control. And gun control is always going to be a thing that we have to talk about. And so, and then not just about gun control, it's also about how we act on stereotypes when it comes to encountering people we don't know. Right. So if we assume that a Black person walking around in the streets is automatically a threat, then that changes our behavior versus how we don't assume that young white children are threats, ignoring the fact that young white people are the people who are committing the most like mass shootings around the country. And so it's that sort of stereotype that the show is trying to interrogate in terms of, if we view the Black body as a threat, then what does that mean politically? And so when it shows up the way that, like, we had a Black president, but there was still, movement around whether or not he's legitimate. And because people are threatened by a Black body, they will do everything in their power to dehumanize, um, to remove authority from the Black body. And so, what I appreciate about that interaction with how politics comes into the show without actually coming into the show is that there's this emphasis that it doesn't matter if we don't actually talk about voting. It doesn't matter if we don't actually talk about legislature, because a Black body is a political object because of the way that it is used, the way that it is legislated, and the fact that we use our bodies to how we have to constantly use our bodies in sacrifice for the greater good, right? We think about all of the lives lost in order to gain civil rights. We think of all the lives lost in order to gain the basic assumptions of what it means to live in the world. And because the Black body has always been legislated in terms of slavery, in terms of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, we can't ignore it when we are talking about Blackness. And so, though the show itself doesn't necessarily talk about like the specifics of politics associated with it, it is something that is embedded throughout the show because it has to be. Like, there's no piece of art in the world right now that engages with people of color that is not about politics. And it's the same way with women. Like, anytime you put women on stage, we have to talk about what that means, because people are afraid of women in public, which is like the whole reason suffrage was like an issue in the first place, is that giving women the right to vote means giving them the right to change things and making them make decisions, or allowing them to make decisions that actually impact everyone. And that's why the Black body is also always under threat, because there's a fear that if we are given power, if we are provided platforms, that we will use it to unseat those who have always been in power. And part of that is like, well, yeah, because not all of you should be in power. But a lot of it is just like, no, we should make sure that we're trying to take care of everyone, because the Black community is very much about a communal social network. It's all about relationships. And that is antithesis to capitalism. That's antithesis to white supremacy, which is very individualistic and very like singular minded. While the Black community is more of like a hive mind, it's about all of us together and making sure we are all taken care of.
Perfect. Thank you. I really appreciate, like I said, that about roadmap. And I think you're 100% correct in all your observations and facts. And I think that the audience will like appreciate that about roadmap as well as I did when I read it. So I can't wait to see it on the stage in performance. Um, One of the last questions that I have, which is just to switch it up a little bit,
Mhm.
um, what are three unusual adjectives you would use to describe roadmap?
Oh, that's good. Three unusual adjectives I'd use to describe roadmap. I'd probably go with uh church,
I love that.
Does that
Church.
count?
It counts 100%.
I'm gonna go with church. I'm gonna go with astonishing, because there's all these things that you learn in the show that you may have already known, but you didn't realize you knew it. Like you hear, like you know how that goes. Like someone tells you something, and you're like, "Oh, I did know that,"
Mhm.
but like not in the way that you were told. If that makes
Right.
sense. So I'm gonna go with astonishing. And then uh
The third one always gets me too. Anytime I have to like use three of anything to describe something, I'm like, I'm good with the first two. And then the third one always gets me. But
let me think. Spiritual. I'm gonna go with that.
yes,
I know that's also church, but like,
I
but
think they're
no, but it's
different.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
it's
different,
different.
right?
Church is more so about like being in a place in a community of worship with others, which I think
Yes.
roadmap for sure.
Yeah.
Astonishing because you're right about just like as an audience member, as a reader of this, I was like, wow, yeah, I was aware of this, but just how you
Hmm.
presented it in the work and through Dorian's story, it like kind of feels like you had a slight veil on your eyes and it's been lifted and
Yes.
it's back in the forefront of your mind. Um,
Yes.
and spiritual, 100%. I think the novelist is, and Dan
Yeah.
and just the entirety of a choreo poem itself is a very spiritual experience and a very
Yeah.
communal experience. So
Yes.
I like that.
Okay. Yeah, we
I
did
got
it.
you. I like that. I love
Yeah, we did it.
that. Okay, and lastly, I just want to ask you, what can audiences expect to take away from Roadmap?
Oh, audiences. Ooh, that's a good question. Audiences can expect to take away, just like a newfound understanding of what it means to live afraid all the time, um, but also a a sense of gratitude for the world that allows like blackness to succeed, and I also hope that the audience like recognizes their role in allowing blackness to exist in the future, basically. There are two really important lines in the show, and one of them is in the beginning and the other's in the end. And the one in the beginning is there are black people in the future, which is something we've been which is something we've said for like years, right? I can't remember who that's attributed to, but it's a thing that I've seen, and it receives such backlash. Like people get very upset when they hear that, which doesn't make any sense, right? Because it assumes like there's two responses. It's either there are black people in the future, which means we survive, and that's a good thing. But it doesn't assume that there are no white people in the future. But I think white people view it that way. So there's that responsive rage. Um, but then there's the other response, which I think is just comforting, because it's like that. There's that T-shirt that everyone wears. It says, "I've been to the future and we won."
Mm,
Right? And it's stuff like that. It's like, we survived, we got through it. And there's like joy in our future. And at the end, there's that line that says, you deserve to grow old. And there's a luxury associated with that that I don't think white people are aware of, that black people are afraid that they're never gonna like grow up, you
yeah.
know? And it's something we don't talk about as much as I think we probably should. But it is a fear that we have as a community that we're not going to grow up.
Mhm.
And it's why we get so excited when Black people are still alive after decades, right? It's why we celebrate our birthdays like they're holidays, because like every single year that we are still on this planet is like an act of resistance.
Mhm.
And if we make it past 60, if we make it past 70, it's like it's not just a miracle, like it's cause for celebration. And so yeah. So I think I hope that people walk away recognizing that it is the responsibility of us all to keep us on earth. Like it's a responsibility of it's not just the responsibility of Black people to make sure that other Black people stay alive. Like it is a responsibility of everyone to make sure that we aren't just killing each other for no reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And
Of course.
yeah, there is this over like the ending does include joy specifically for Black men, the Black families. So I'm so excited to see Roadmap produced with PPADC. And thank you so much, Monica, for your time today and for having a chat with me and discussing Roadmap and your journey as a writer and the significance behind the choreo poem. And I look forward to seeing Roadmap, as I'm sure hope everyone else is who's watching. And be sure to check out the link in our bio where you can access tickets or general information and head to the PPADC website, which will all be in the bio. So please check that out. Thank you again, Monica. It's been a really amazing time at discussing Roadmap with you. So I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you, Ebony.
Thank you.